So I'm Paul Taylor and I'm managing NatureScot's project to develop a new biodiversity metric tool for Scotland's planning system. I've been with SNH or NatureScot for over 20 years and I've worked in various roles as an operations officer, a site condition monitoring officer, and for the last decade or so as a renewable energy casework advisor, mainly looking at onshore wind applications. I came into the project in May, taking over from Simon Brooks, who retired at the time. And I've been working with Craig Smith, who also started in the project in May in the project officer role. So as a small team, we've also drawn on some limited time from Stuart, who'll be presenting later, and from Grace Gubbins, who's on the call today. So today, Craig and I have been jointly giving these metric-related presentations, but today it's just me. And this presentation, I think it'll be possibly around 40 minutes. And you'll just be hearing the one voice throughout, but you've got Stuart's voice to look forward to later. In the presentation, I'll provide a bit of background on the project and the timescales around producing a Scottish tool. I'll say something about the English statutory biodiversity net gain approach, or BNG approach, and how this differs from the Scottish approach. Then I'll explain how the English metric works before returning to look at what we're trying to do and where we've reached. And after covering the background and the metric project that way, I'll move on to touch on the questions we asked you via the registration survey. Namely, what works well about the metric approach or a metric approach? What type of preparations would help a Scottish biodiversity metric work well for planning authorities? And in the interim, can things be done to help planning authorities better consider biodiversity enhancement? After that, we'll get into a slightly more interactive session being run by Trevor, including questions and answers, I think. I'm going to start off with some headline messages to help ensure that the key points are covered early on, even if this leads to a bit of repetition during the rest of the presentation. So here are some key points about the metric project. In December 2023, NatureScot was commissioned by the Scottish Government to develop a biodiversity metric suitable for use in supporting delivery of NPF Policy 3B in Scotland. And Policy 3B relates to national or major developments or those subject to EIA. The policy includes a requirement for such development to include significant biodiversity enhancements that leave nature in a demonstrably better state. And see the partial quote there in the slide from Policy 3B. Our Commission will focus on adapting England's statutory biodiversity metric. And you can see a screenshot of the English metric user guide and the tool spreadsheet on the right of this slide. Our approach will seek to build on existing experience of applying metrics to development proposals, particularly where this concerns the use and application of metrics within Scotland. So, for example, we've been looking at the Scottish and Southern Energy Renewables metric toolkit, which itself is an adaptation of the English metric. We've been speaking with various consultants who've been using metrics in Scotland. And in terms of outcomes, the delivery of a Scottish biodiversity metric is intended to provide consistency of approach. It'll be a tool to help inform both the siting and design of development proposals, as well as supporting robust evidence-based decision-making by planning and consenting authorities. The Commission's final outputs will include a Scottish biodiversity metric tool for use in the planning system and accompanying guidance, together with any other supporting information. The project's still at a relatively early stage. We're not able to give a definite date for completion of the project due to the wide-ranging and complex nature of the work. Earlier this year, we'd suggested that a Scottish metric version 1.0 might be published early in 2025, while allowing that forecast may be ambitious. However, since then, as we've been working through what needs done, we've realised that early 2025 is ambitious. Our project plan is now looking towards 2026 before we're likely to be consulting on a draft tool and guidance. We'll revisit that project plan as we progress to get a better idea of delivery dates And if there are pragmatic ways to reduce timescales, we'll certainly take those on board, as we know that there's appetite for a Scottish tool. Now, just going back to cover some background on how the project arose, NPF Policy 3B says that to inform biodiversity being in a demonstrably better state, best practice assessment methods should be used, but doesn't specify a particular assessment methodology or approach. Therefore, we know that a range of approaches were and are still being used to demonstrate positive effects, positive biodiversity change on development sites, and these include qualitative and quantitative approaches. To explore whether a Scottish Biodiversity Metric could provide a more consistent method to support assessment of biodiversity enhancement, in 2023 the Scottish Government commissioned independent research undertaken by Scotland's Rural College, or SRUC. One of the key findings of the resulting September 2023 report was that with refinement, the English biodiversity metric could be adapted for use in the Scottish planning system. And I've slightly paraphrased in the slide here because at the time they were looking at version 3.1 of the English metric. The report also pointed towards some of the key changes that might need to be addressed to adapt the English metric for Scotland. In December 2023, the report then led to a commission from the Scottish Government to NatureScot to develop a biodiversity metric for Scotland's planning system to support delivery of NPF 4 Policy 3B. So that's the background, and now just to summarise the scope of the commission, it's to develop a metric that supports Policy 3B. It relates to national major and or EIA development, not local development. We're adapting England's statutory biodiversity metric, and in doing so we'll draw on the SRUC report recommendations as well as existing experience in Scotland. Collaboration and engagement will be central to the approach. We want to have widespread and ongoing engagement with stakeholders. We'll encourage stakeholders from different development sectors to trial proposed alterations to provide better understanding and to reduce the risk of unintended consequences. We also want to provide advanced signalling to industry and to planners regarding any future or proposed changes to practice in Scotland, for example on broad principles which can inform interim best practice and application of Policy 3B. In addition to ongoing engagement while developing the metric, the proposed tool and draft guidance will be consulted on. The final outputs of the project will include the metric tool itself and supporting guidance and information for users. And besides the user guide, we'll also consider supporting content such as case studies and FAQs to aid understanding. And we'll look at the introductory capacity building webinars as well. At this point, it's worth noting that we've recently created a Scottish Biodiversity Metric webpage, providing an outline of the work. The webpage will be a place for us to post updates and host open consultations on the emerging approach. But now, given that our focus is on adapting the English metric for use in Scotland, I'll provide a brief overview of the English statutory biodiversity metric. Hopefully this will provide a bit of context to then go and discuss the changes that we're tackling. I know that some of you, well, around 10% according to the registration poll, will already have some level of experience of dealing with the English tool, but I trust that because it's a relatively complex tool, the overview won't go amiss for anyone. Start with a few higher level messages, not about the English metric tool itself, but about England's biodiversity net gain or BNG approach. An initial point to make on terminology is that that BNG is considered generally analogous to achieving positive effects for biodiversity, noting that we don't tend to use the term BNG much in Scotland. Anyway, here are some hopefully helpful background points about the English approach. In February 2024, mandatory biodiversity net gain was introduced as a new legal planning requirement in England. And BNG is a process that requires the habitats lost on a development site to be accounted for and losses measurably addressed. On the development site, patches of different vegetation types, such as woodland, are mapped. Data on their size, ecology, and location are used to derive biodiversity units, and this involves the use of metrics set out in legislation and supplied in spreadsheets. Under the statutory framework for BNG, and subject to some exceptions, every grant of planning permission is deemed to have been granted subject to the condition that the biodiversity gain objective is met. And the biodiversity gain objective is for development to deliver at least 10% increase in biodiversity value relative to the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat. The biodiversity gain condition is a pre-commencement condition. Once planning permission has been granted, a biodiversity gain plan must be submitted and approved by the planning authority before commencement of development. The biodiversity gain plan must show how at least 10% of gain in biodiversity units will be delivered over a 30-year post-development period. Biodiversity net gain, however, isn't just a post-permission matter. The English guidance emphasises that to ensure the biodiversity gain objective is met and the condition can be discharged successfully, it's important that BNG is considered throughout the planning process. And in effect, this normally means that a draft biodiversity gain plan is submitted at application stage. The offsetting and the gain is generally achieved by enhancing or creating the same types of habitats as those that will be lost. And this gain can be achieved on the development site itself or in an off-site area. If it's to be delivered off-site, under the English approach, information about the habitat improvement site needs to be added to a statutory biodiversity register. And this is a national log of net gain sites that aims to prevent double counting and facilitate monitoring. To be eligible for registration on the gain site register, land must be secured by either a Section 106 legal agreement, broadly equivalent to a Section 75 agreement, or through a conservation covenant. And as a last resort, if the developer is struggling to deliver through on-site biodiversity gains or registered off-site biodiversity gains, the habitat improvement may be delivered through the purchase of statutory biodiversity credits from the government. The statutory credit system has been set up specifically to support BNG, and the credits are purposely priced very high to ensure that this is a route of last resort. It's perhaps worth noting now that there are no plans in Scotland to introduce an off-site register or a statutory credit system. In England, the biodiversity gain plan needs to set out measures taken to minimise the adverse impact of development on biodiversity. It then needs to assess the pre-development and post-development values of the habitat. And these values require to be assessed in terms of a statutory metric tool with, as I've said, the overall requirement for post-development value to exceed the pre-development value by at least 10% over a 30-year development period. And the metric is highly prescriptive in terms of how the value of proposed replacement habitat is to be assessed. So what's different about the Scottish approach? Well, both the Scottish and English land use planning systems recognise that just offsetting impacts on biodiversity is no longer sufficient, and that development must make a positive contribution towards improving biodiversity. However, these systems have pursued different approaches as to how this should be done. The English approach seeks to address the issue by introducing a legal requirement to provide a minimum level of biodiversity net gain. Scotland, on the other hand, has continued to deal with the need for biodiversity enhancement as a policy issue, with NPF4 noting that policies should be read as a whole, and it's for the decision maker to take account of all relevant policies, albeit Policy 1 gives significant weight to the nature crisis to ensure that it's recognised as a priority in all plans and decisions. Another difference is that different development hierarchy thresholds apply for use of a metric. In England, bar some exceptions, the statutory metric applies to major and small sites, i.e. the vast majority of applications. It doesn't yet apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects. It's expected to apply to those from November 2025, whereas a Scottish metric would be directed towards quantifying effects for national major and EAI development, i.e. Policy 3 development, but not local development. There are different associated processes, systems and guidance in place between England and Scotland, with the comprehensive framework supporting statutory BNG in England in part reflective of the need for a robust system to support the legal requirement, but also reflective of the longer period that England has taken effectively taken the longer period over which it's effectively taken a metric-related approach, including prior to BNG being officially legislated. And we can touch on the desire for clear guidance towards the end of the presentation when, again, considering your registration feedback comments. Anyway, back to discussing the metric tool itself. As I mentioned, the statutory metric calculation tool must be submitted as part of the biodiversity gain plan. And at its core, the English metric is an Excel-based spreadsheet tool that uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity. Albeit it's quite a complex spreadsheet containing a lot of information and a lot of pop-up tabs. There's an accompanying user guide. There are related condition assessment sheets for each habitat type. And here's a simplified diagram representing the main components of the tool to help show how it works. I'm going to take a little time to talk through how the tool works, but there are also good SciEM YouTube videos out there that can do similar. And there are links to some of these SciEM resources at the foot of our NatureScot metric webpage. To determine the baseline biodiversity value of an application site, you map and measure the extent and type of each habitat present. So see the purple boxes in the top row there. And you also assess the condition of each habitat parcel using a set of standardized assessment sheets. See the second blue box along in the top row. The condition assessment sheets will help you assign a condition score for each habitat parcel. When entering this data into the spreadsheet, each habitat type is also automatically assigned a distinctiveness score by the tool. So you can see in the left-hand blue box in the top row. These distinctiveness scores are based on a Natural England background assessment of various criteria for each habitat, including the rarity value of that habitat in England. And the English metric user guide describes distinctiveness as a measure based on the type of habitat and its distinguishing features, and this includes consideration of species richness and rarity, the extent to which the habitat is protected by designations, and the degree to which a habitat supports a species rarely found in other habitats. Strategic significance is another multiplier shown in the top row. Strategic significance is the local significance of the habitat based on its location and habitat type. And this is normally determined by the user considering if it is an ecologically desirable habitat for that location based on information that might be contained or published in a local strategy. So for example, in Scotland, the user could use a drop down to select a more positive multiplier score if the habitat was flagged as a priority in a local biodiversity action plan or other strategy. The English metric user guide advises that users should assign strategic significance using relevant local documents, and the preference is to base the score on presence within a published local nature recovery strategy if it's available. And understand that these local nature recovery strategies are roughly the equivalent or the English equivalent of our own proposed nature networks. Values or scores for each of these components are multiplied together by the spreadsheet formula to provide a baseline biodiversity value for each mapped parcel. And once all the parcels are entered, the spreadsheet will give a biodiversity value, unit value for the entire application site. Now to move on to the post-development biodiversity value. You'll see that for the post-development prediction of biodiversity value, this is based on similar factors shown in blue, but there are also additional risk multipliers shown in yellow here. I'll get on to discussing the yellow risk multipliers in a minute, but for now it's worth saying that for the post-development estimate of biodiversity value, the user needs to enter how much of each baseline habitat parcel is proposed to be retained as well as how much the developer's proposing to either enhance the condition of or to newly create, how much habitat they're proposing to newly create. And if proposing to enhance the condition of habitat, the user needs to enter information into the spreadsheet on what the proposed target condition will be. And this is based on thresholds set out in the condition assessment sheets. For example, trying to achieve a moderate condition or a good condition. In the baseline tab of the spreadsheet, the user enters the extent being retained and the extent being enhanced. In separate spreadsheet tabs, then the user enters more detail about enhancement and creation. And there are separate tabs for on-site enhancement, on-site creation, and off-site enhancement and off-site creation. And the whole aim is to use the tool to show that taking account of predicted habitat loss and proposed enhancement and creation, your resultant number of biodiversity units goes beyond the level required to achieve no net loss, i.e. to fully compensate for the lost habitat units, and that it reaches a net gain of 10% on the biodiversity value of all habitats contained in the application site red line boundary. So just to emphasise that last point, the English metric looks for a 10% uplift on the biodiversity value of all habitats contained in the application's red line boundary. And this includes any habitats that are unaffected by the development. So the bigger your application site boundary is in terms of encompassing unaffected habitats, the more the baseline biodiversity value of the site and the more units you'll need to provide or to achieve that 10% uplift. I can come back to that a bit later when discussing the so-called red line boundary issue that we'll need to look at for a Scottish tool. So now, while post-development prediction of biodiversity is based on similar factors shown in blue, also takes account of the additional risk multiplier shown in yellow here. The difficulty risk multiplier, that's the yellow box on the left, is a negative multiplier, in other words, a value of less than 1, for example, 0.33 or 0.36 or 0.66. And it's automatically assigned by the tool dependent on the habitat type that you intend to create or enhance. The multiplier value assigned reflects how difficult DEFRA has considered it to be to either create that habitat type or to reach that target habitat condition. It's described in the English Metric User Guide as a measure which represents the uncertainty in the effectiveness of management techniques used to enhance or create habitat. So it's basically a measure of your likely less than perfect success in achieving what you set out to achieve. A multiplier of 0.33, for example, in relation to blanket bog restoration, would mean that the tool predicts that you only have 33% chance of achieving your target outcome. The time to target condition multiplier is another negative multiplier, and that takes account of the estimated gap of time between losing any habitat due to the development and creating or enhancing habitat to reach your proposed target condition. It's described in the English User Guide as the average time taken between starting creation or enhancement of habitats and that habitat reaching its target condition or distinctiveness. It effectively applies a penalty reduction in biodiversity units in acknowledgement that you aren't going to be achieving instant returns and that there's less biodiversity value in the meantime. There's also a spatial risk multiplier. The aim is to encourage delivery of biodiversity action on or close to the development site where possible. Off-site delivery is allowed, though a penalty is applied by the spatial risk multiplier if this is intended to happen outside the same local planning authority or national character area in England. The English Metric User Guide says spatial risk represents the relationship between the location of biodiversity loss on site and where the off-site habitat is being delivered, and it's applied to off-site interventions only. So that's the 3 risk multipliers. The metrics therefore used to calculate the baseline biodiversity unit value on a site before development. It predicts how many biodiversity units are lost, and it tells you whether a development's proposals for post-development habitat creation or enhancement are sufficient to achieve the required 10% net gain in biodiversity units. This diagram is, of course, a simplified way of looking at it, and the spreadsheet takes a bit of getting used to, but the formula work in the same way. I'll just touch on a few other things that are not illustrated in these diagrams. So firstly, within the metric, some habitats are recognised as irreplaceable. This includes blanket bog, coastal sand dunes, and ancient woodland, and it reflects the difficulties involved in recreating these habitats once they're destroyed. These habitats are set aside from metric calculations and require bespoke compensation to be agreed with the consenting authority to address any habitat losses or deterioration. Secondly, the English metric has a number of underpinning rules and principles which guide its application. These include a set of trading rules that set requirements for compensation of habitat loss based on the habitat distinctiveness values. Broadly speaking, highly or very highly distinct habitats should be replaced with the same habitat type. Medium and low distinctiveness habitats can be replaced with the same habitats, with habitats of the same distinctiveness category or higher. And thirdly and finally, the biodiversity metric tool can calculate different types of biodiversity units. There are 3 types of biodiversity units which are calculated in 3 separate modules of the metric. These are area habitat units, hedgerow units, and watercourse units. Because these 3 different modules create different types of biodiversity units based on different criteria, the English approach keeps these separate in terms of the user needing to show that they're meeting a net gain requirement for each. So just to simplify the whole thing in this diagram, the difference between the pre-development biodiversity value of the site and the post-development estimate gives you your projected uplift. An English planning system prescribes a mandatory requirement for all developments to deliver a net gain of at least 10%. And under the English approach, this needs to be assessed with the official metric tool. And any habitats that are created or enhanced must be maintained for at least 30 years. So sorry, that's a lot of information to take in, especially if you're new to the English biodiversity metric, but it does help provide context for what we're doing in developing a Scottish metric based on the English one. So now I'll touch on what we've been doing. As I mentioned at the start, NatureScot's work on the metric began earlier this year, initially led by my colleague Simon Brooks. Myself and Craig started in May and took over from Simon. A public consultation exploring the key issues that needed to be addressed took place in May, and we had over 90 responses from a range of stakeholders. A roundtable discussion also took place in May, and there's been ongoing wide-ranging stakeholder discussions since then. This has included a SIME conference in October, and we had some really good follow-up from that. We've also had very informative peatland-related discussions with the renewables industry, noting that peatland issues are seen as a priority for the project, and the SSER, for example, has created its own metric toolkit. And all the feedback will help inform the metric. We've got a lot of good comments to build on, including detailed comments on what doesn't work well based on experience of applying the tool in Scotland. We've got our webpage on the metric project, and we'll keep updating that as we progress. And the page includes a link to our key issues consultation and the related summary report on the feedback we received. The issues report gives a fuller picture of the adaptations we'll need to consider. But in the following few slides, I'll touch on some of these. So firstly, habitat classification or survey systems. The English metric uses a range of established habitat classification systems, in addition to a few that are bespoke to the metric itself. For most terrestrial habitats, though, the English tool uses the UK HAB classification system, which has now become the norm in terms of survey in England. Whereas in Scotland, we've historically tended to use the Phase 1 system as the standard broad survey methodology, alongside NVC to capture more detail. It's likely that NVC survey will continue to be required where more detail is needed for EIA. But in feedback we've had so far, opinions have differed sharply on whether to follow the English approach and adopt UK HAB, or to use Phase 1 as the main classification system underpinning the tool. There are some clear benefits to using UK HAB if we're adapting a tool that already uses it. And those who've got experience of using UKHab appeared more optimistic about its suitability and highlighted that upskilling can be achieved relatively quickly. But there were also comments that the English metric's use of UKHab classifications may need refinement when developing a tool for Scotland, for example, in relation to upland and wetland habitats. So we're now looking to soon commission a review of UKHab in the Scottish context so that we can better understand any changes or adaptations that may be required. And we hope that this review can report back in March to allow us to move quite quickly towards deciding the preferred approach. As part of that review, we'll need to think about whether provision of a translation or correspondence table between Phase 1 and UKHab is a good way to go, noting that sometimes this can lead to a challenge of relevant information being lost in the process. Peatland, in relation to the onshore wind, has been identified as a priority issue for the metric project. Peatland loss and compensation ratios are a very live issue, and there's a desire to resolve tensions around that. And a view that came across in the consultation feedback was that the English metric doesn't handle developments in peatland habitats very well and is not as well tested in upland habitats in general. And this, in large part, is why SSER has developed its own toolkit to take a different approach for peatland. So as a team, we've been looking at how the English metric, the SSER metric, and our own peatland guidance treat the key issues. And we're engaging internally with industry and with the Peatland Expert Advisory Group to seek consensus in an approach. And in terms of adapting the English metric for peatland, issues to resolve include, for example, whether the tool's peatland habitat classifications are sufficient, whether the condition assessment criteria are right, whether those risk multipliers accurately reflect the rate of success and the time period within which peatland restoration could be delivered. And part of the discussion is also about indirect effects on peatland around infrastructure and how far such impacts are likely to extend and what they might be should the impact be treated as a complete loss of habitat or just a drop in condition. There's also the so-called red line boundary issue to address, and this raises a concern for renewables industry in particular, noting that the English metric seeks an uplift of 10% on the biodiversity value of all habitats within the site boundary. But the onshore wind developments can have a lot of high value habitat on site, not all of which is affected. So we'll have to look at that issue. The intention is that through a process of engagement we've already got in train, we'll find solutions for peatland that are as far as possible evidence-based and that stakeholders will consider workable and proportionate. We'll be working to hopefully establish agreed principles that can help provide more clarity in the interim and that we can take forward then into tool development. Resolving an approach to peatland is only one, albeit important, strand of the metric project, and we'll seek to progress thinking as concurrently as we can on the full range of Scottish habitats. So, having gathered feedback on key issues and focused on peatland, we're now preparing briefings and focus questions for our habitat specialists based on the key issues that need to be considered and the comments we've received from stakeholders. As part of that engagement, we'll be looking to review distinctiveness scores, risk multipliers, and habitat condition assessment criteria to ensure that they're appropriate for Scotland. And in the technical annexes to the English metric, there are tables containing a lot of data underpinning the calculations. So this is what we'll be visiting to check it's appropriate in a Scottish context. We'll be engaging with specialists across a wide range of habitat types, including, for example, wetlands, woodlands, heathlands and scrub, grassland, intertidal, urban and freshwater, including lakes and watercourses. As part of the freshwater discussion, we'll be considering the watercourse condition assessment methodology and whether, what methodology should be used for that. We'll be thinking about whether a consideration of intertidal habitat within the metric is really the best approach, or if there are alternatives. And more generally, we'll be thinking about the approach to Scottish irreplaceable habitats within the Scottish metric and what a Scottish list of irreplaceable habitats should contain. We'll be looking at the strategic significance multiplier and establish an approach applicable to Scotland. We'll review the criteria for assessing spatial risk and again establish a tailored approach applicable to Scotland. So I hope that helps give a flavour of the scope of the work. But as I say, the key issues consultation feedback report will give you a fuller picture. So that covers the background and the biodiversity metric approaches more generally, and the project to develop a Scottish biodiversity metric or a Scottish planning metric. It's maybe now worth moving on to look at some of the questions that you asked via the pre-event registration survey. Firstly, we asked what works well about a biodiversity metric approach. And so I think a strong message that came across there was the kind of, there's a benefit in terms of consistency and level playing field. It's seen as a kind of transparent approach that provides clear criteria for developers to meet. And we asked what type of preparations would help a Scottish biodiversity metric work well for planning authorities. And as Trevor said at the beginning, the key messages there were around capacity building, training from the beginning, not assuming too much for non-specialists, and also specialist training for planners and council ecologists to enable them to review submissions of metric type approaches. For resourcing, there was the kind of concern about in-house, that kind of sometimes lack of in-house biodiversity expertise. And there was the desire for clear guidance, producing guidance well in advance and explaining how and why the Scottish metric in guidance, explaining how and why the Scottish metric would vary from the English metric. And also there was a kind of mention of it would be helpful to have guidance on how to provide biodiversity units for off-site gain. In relation to that, someone also noted that it'd be good to have a kind of clear cut-off date for when advanced habitat works, off-site works, could be allowed to be considered as eligible for providing towards the approach. The guidance should also cover how we deal with irreplaceable habitats, and it should look at how the metric aligns with other requirements. So, for example, protected species requirements and EIA requirements, and how it works with planning permission and principal applications where there's limited detail at application stage. So there was also a plea for templates, kind of standardised processes and forms, and an easy-to-use checklist for developers to present information, and possibly a kind of template game plan similar to what's done in England. And there was the kind of plea for simplicity, a simple tool to use. And it is a good ask, but I think there is something around, certainly my journey in learning about metrics, it's quite a complex kind of tool to get your head around. So maybe the idea of a very simple tool isn't going to be something that can be easily delivered. There'll be a bit of capacity building around that. And we asked what type of preparations would help what can be done to help planning authorities better consider biodiversity enhancement. And here, I think there is, in the interim, a similar kind of thoughts. There was the idea of training, skills training, capacity building, and that could be on the English metric, given that we'll be adapting it. The idea of regular forums for planners and council ecologists to keep them engaged as the process progresses, and clear guidance that firms up best practice, possibly even a new message encouraging that biodiversity enhancement needs to be quantified in the interim. So that was one, I think a couple of people made that point or that opinion. And also more guidance on the potential for off-site provision on monitoring and maintenance requirements. So just kind of go back a little bit, and as noted earlier, NPF 4 Policy 3B says that best practice assessment methods should be used, but doesn't specify a particular methodology or approach. And the Scottish Government's November 2023 guidance makes the point that assessment can be either qualitative or quantitative. And it advises that in the meantime, a flexible approach will be required to avoid delays to planning decisions. But I guess the challenge is sometimes how to interpret that flexibility. And in the absence of a national metric tool, stakeholders such as Scottish and Southern Energy have produced their own adaptations of the English metric, which they consider work better in the Scottish context. And planning authorities such as Highland Council are recommending the use of a metric approach tool to applicants. So what can we do to help planning authorities in the interim? I think what we can do as a metric team is try to engage as effectively as can moving forward with the metric work, and we can schedule future improvement service events. We'll think about training capacity building needs around the metric. I think we can also reflect on the feedback we've heard from you in the interim about how to kind of perhaps update our own web guidance. There's possibly something about setting out expectations of good practice principles around the use of metrics more generally, where these are being employed. For example, even basics like the good practice around providing a copy of the Excel workbook and the user guide and flagging any key differences in approach from the English metric if it's an adaptation. So kind of basically just making sure that everything's as transparent as possible when a metric approach is used. Also providing a clear explanation of the ecological rationale to support the numbers. I think that's probably something to emphasise. Just remembering that the habitat metric is just a tool and it shouldn't primarily be about the numbers, but about how those numbers help support and validate professional judgment piece. The English metric approach also focuses on habitats, but there's perhaps a need to clarify that isn't just about habitats. And for example, the UK government explanatory notes on the 2021 Environment Act says that the biodiversity metric does not address impacts on species, recognise the significance of site designations, or take account of indirect impacts, cumulative impacts, or in combination impacts. And in recognition of these limitations, the biodiversity net gain requirement for development on sites is additional to any existing legal or policy requirements for statutory protected areas and their features. So just another thing to remember is that the metric isn't going to be a replacement for other policies or good practice survey and assessment guidance. It's a tool to sit alongside these. Maybe we need to emphasise these kind of points and guidance that helps you in the interim. Also, personally, I do see something in the idea of a kind of template approach helping in the interim, perhaps something akin to what Stuart's included as an annex to the Developing with Nature guidance. And our web guidance on enhancing biodiversity encourages that information on predicted losses, the proposed mitigation compensation enhancements should be clearly set out and concisely summarised in any application so this can be clearly understood by decision makers. And a recommended template could maybe achieve this and help signpost the reviewer to more detailed information that's contained in the application. I know personally from previous experience as a renewable energy casework advisor, how hard it can sometimes be to find the information you want in a large AI application. So sometimes a template approach might be a way forward there. Anyway, I think I've probably talked long enough, and I hope this presentation's helped provide some background on the work we're doing and more generally help those who may not have had much understanding of what a metric approach is. There's lots of food for thought in your pre-registration feedback.